London, one of the most important and influential cities of all times. Who hasn't heard about London at some point in their lives? The Big Ben, London Eye, Buckingham Palace, the Tower Bridge, the Millennium Bridge. These are just some of the most common landmarks in the city, the ones everybody knows. However, little is known about the historic events occurred in the city previous to our time. The Roman ages, the Viking ages, the Middle Ages, the Tudor period, the Battle of Hastings, the English Civil War, the Great Plague, or the Great Fire of London. This last event caused great impact in the city. It was one of the most important episodes in its history, and now we will discuss it. Hardly any other fire had caused so much material damage in one same place and in such a short period of time. It started on a Sunday and ended on a Thursday. 13,500 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, 3 of the western city wall gates, and many more public buildings were all completely destroyed. This, in money terms, was estimated at a value of £10 million, which would be the equivalent to £1.7 billion in our time. Why was this fire so devastating? Why did it spread so fast, and why couldn't it be stopped? Well, for starters, the materials with which the city was built were very flammable. Houses were made out of wood and thatch, and were organized in a very unregulated way, making the streets highly congested. Not only that, but also, most houses had jetties, upper floors that occupy more than the lower levels, making it incredibly easy for the fire to pass from one house to another. In addition to all of these circumstances, there is also the fact that firefighting methods were not used properly. One of these methods consisted in demolishing houses in order to create fire breaks. This would have been very effective if they would have done it as soon as the fire started, but the order to start demolishing houses wasn't given until Sunday afternoon, 18 hours after the fire had started. Why, you'll be wondering. Well, the thing is, the mayor at the time turned out to be a very coward man with a huge lack of leadership. He was so scared of what was happening that he actually ran away from the city. Nothing was heard of him for a while after that. It was only when the king himself became aware of the situation that the order to start demolishing houses took effect. But, as I said before, 18 hours had already passed. The fire was out of control. Also, once the firefighting brigades were ready to help, their efforts were frustrated mainly because of the narrowness of the streets. Imagine people running up and down, screaming, desperate. Carts travelling away from the fire, loaded with furniture. People who had just lost everything camping in the street with their belongings. It was impossible for the brigades to come through. Moving on to the next problem, you might be thinking, but London is right next to a river. Why don't they just get water from there and use it to extinguish the fire? Well, there was a slight problem that prevented the citizens from coming close to the river. See, in a normal situation, with a normal fire, there would be people filling the streets from the river to wherever the fire would be, passing buckets of water up and down in order to try and extinguish the fire. But in this case, no one was trying to put the fire out. Everybody was trying to escape. Because of this, the fire was free to roam all the way down to the wharves. Unluckily, these wharves were full of warehouses that contained flammable materials. So you can imagine. Practically all access to the river was cut off because of these warehouses on fire. As a last resort, London brought into action its own version of fire engines. These hadn't been very effective in previous fires, because they had to come from a long distance. Not all of them had wheels, and they had limited reach because they didn't have hoses. But still, they had to try. For these engines to work, they first had to fill them up with water. Luckily, even though the warehouses by the river were on fire, there were still some parts of the riverbank that could be accessed. This took a very long time, though. Many men were trying to maneuver with the heavy engines, but some of them ended up toppling over into the river. And by the time the rest of them could be useful, the heat of the fire was so great that the engines could not come within a useful distance of the flames. All of this situation had great consequences on the population. People didn't want to leave their homes. They would only leave when the flames were practically inside them. They would run off to the nearest parish church to seek refuge there, only to have to move again a few hours later because the fire inevitably caught up with them. It wasn't until Monday, the second day of the fire, that people realized that they had to leave the city in order to survive. So everybody ran towards the gates, causing stampedes and blocking the doors. Luckily, they did get out, forming refugee camps on the outside of the city walls. The wealthiest people wanted to move away as far as possible and with as many belongings as they could carry. This turned out to be a business opportunity for the less fortunate who happened to have carts or boats. Just so you have an idea of how profitable this business was, before the fire, hiring a cart would have only cost a few shillings. But on Monday, this service rose to as much as £40, which would be the equivalent to £4,000 in our time. Imagine. Now let's talk a little bit about St. Paul's Cathedral. It had huge stone walls and a wide yard in front of it. Obviously, everybody thought it was a safe refuge, and even more so because of the churchyard, which would act as a natural firebreak. There was only one slight problem. The cathedral was covered in wooden scaffolding because it was under restoration. The scaffolding caught fire on Tuesday. This was tragic not only because of the cathedral itself, but because its crypts had been filled with piles and piles of books which inevitably ended up burning in flames. Imagine how much literature was lost there. You would think things couldn't get any worse at this point. Well, I'm afraid they did. You see, the strong winds would carry sparks from the fire to houses that were still far away from it. This made it seem as though some fires were being set on purpose. What you have to understand is that England was right in the middle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. People started suspecting that the fire had been a plot from the French and Dutch in order to harm the city. This created a wave of panic and fear, and every foreigner suddenly became a suspect. There was street violence everywhere, and many foreign shops were looted or directly leveled to the ground. So how did the fire stop? Well, the strong winds had been one of the main reasons why the fire had spread so fast in the previous days. Luckily, on Tuesday evening, these winds started to drop, and by Wednesday, the fire breaks that had been made by the king's men started to take effect. The fire was finally under control. The last traces of it still had to be put out. 2 months later, coal was still burning in cellars. 6 months later, smoke was still coming out of them. Even though the fire brought death and destruction with it, it did have a more positive side. A year before the fire, London had been suffering from a bubonic plague epidemic, killing over 80,000 people. Some historians suggest that this fire saved lives in the long run, because it burned down all the unsanitary housing and streets with its rats and fleas, which were the main cause for the spreading of the plague. Also, people realized that if they wanted to rebuild the city, they couldn't just reproduce what was there before. Streets were wider now, with improvements in hygiene and fire safety, and buildings were reconstructed with brick and stone, not wood. Also, most of the public architecture that was burned down was rebuilt in the same spot. The most famous one of all is perhaps St. Paul's Cathedral. In conclusion, this great crisis that London was put through was useful for them because they were able to learn from their mistakes. They managed to overcome a devastating situation. They came out stronger. They were able to rebuild themselves in a better way, and that helped them defeat all the other tragedies and wars that were awaiting, and still managed to become one of the most important and influential cities of all times. Thank you so much for watching. This was Verónica Palenzuela speaking. I wanted to talk about this topic because when I first became acquainted with it back in school, I was completely shocked by it. I think this was a great point of inflection for London's history, and I just wanted to share it with you guys, so I hope you enjoyed it. And see you around and take care. Bye bye.